kind of like enchanted rock, except it's mostly limestone. So there's an igneous body under there that's pushing the land up. Aside from that, what the major landforms you see here is the Sierra Madre Oriental / Rocky Mountains that go all the way up through Big Bend and then on up to the NSS convention. And so most of these mountains in this area are limestone, but there is again some igneous stuff. Notably, the Big Bend area is largely igneous, and the Sierra del Carmen is largely igneous. And then further to the east in the Sierra del Burro, where we're talking about, there's some igneous bits that poke up, like Cerro Colorado right here. But for the most part, we've got limestone there, and then we've got these basin and range type mountains here through the Musquiz area. And I'm going to be talking about all the way down to Monclova, where we've got probably the most interesting groundwater site in all of Coahuila, which is this Hundido down here at the south end of the Sierra La Rata. So over the past year, really been concentrating on the Sierra del Burros, but what kind of really got me going back to this area was about 3 years ago when we made the discovery of the Mexican blind cat, a cave fish, here at Lake Amistad. And that got us revisiting blind catfish sites in Coahuila, looking for more sites, and trying to discover more stuff about the shared aquifer between Texas and Coahuila. Another site near that that's of great interest is Goodenough Spring, which is one of the largest springs in Texas. And then I'll be talking about these other sites, El Abra, another Hundido, El Mulato, and the egg funnel here. Let's go on to the next slide. So the Mexican blind cat was, I think it was described in the 1950s. It's a small catfish, about the size of one of your fingers. Really, really cool animal. And it's found in various sites in northern and central Coahuila. Really just northern, from Musquiz up to the border. And it was only known in Mexico until 3 years ago when we found it in Texas. So this says a lot about how the aquifers are connected. It's also an endangered species. It's been listed as one of the earlier species listed as endangered by Fish and Wildlife Service. And what's interesting in it is that it was listed as a foreign endangered species. It didn't occur in the U.S., but like the rhinoceros or whatever, it's considered an endangered species by Fish and Wildlife Service. Well, when we found this animal in Amistad National Recreation Area, that was the first time that a foreign endangered species had come to be found in the U.S., which caused Fish and Wildlife in Washington to do a lot of head scratching. So the site where the blind cat was found was up here at Lake Amistad. Here's Del Rio. And what this shows you is the shared aquifer between Texas and Coahuila, which is the Edwards Aquifer. In this area, in this section here, is really known as the Edwards Trinity, but it extends on both sides of the border, and you can see the symmetrical shape of this landform that's bisected by the Rio Grande. So you've got down cutting here, so these are impermeable surfaces here, but you've got the contributing and recharge zones, and then you've got the Artesian Zone in both states. And so what I'm going to be talking about really is here on the Mexican side. And so this Artesian Zone is where the rocks on the surface are largely impermeable, and so they confine those waters in the aquifer. And such that oftentimes depending on the elevation you're at, when you drill a well in the Artesian Zone in either state, you get an artesian flow where water will just come out of the ground because it's recharging up here, then it gets underneath this cap and it wants to come out. what we don't know very much about at all is where the Edwards Aquifer ends to the south and where this Artesian Zone lies. Here's the town of Muskies right here. So a lot to be discovered down here, and here they've got this other just kind of cut off the Edwards Aquifer right here with a question mark. So I'll be talking a little bit about that stuff farther south. Here's a couple of wells to show you what these artesian wells look like in Coahuila. This one is near Ciudad Acuña, and this is a saline well, or hydrogen sulfide well. You can see all that nasty stuff coming out there, stinky water. Depending on where you drill, and relative to the bad water line in the confined zone or the artesian zone of the Edwards, you can get fresh water, you can get saline water. So there's a line that you cross, temperature increases as you get close to that, and so does the total dissolved solids that leads us at some point to call that bad water, but it really means this saline or hydrogen sulfide water. And a little farther south, here's another artesian well where obviously a huge amount of water coming out. This is down along the east side of the Sierra del Burros, and but this was fresh water, not saline water. This would be a great place, in my mind as a biologist, to put a net over the outflow and try to catch cavefish. And then there's also some natural springs where the water comes out in Northern Coahuila. This is the spring that forms the beginning of the Rio Sabinas at the Kickapoo Indian lands to the west of Muskies. So kind of zooming in on the Sierra del Burro. Again, you can see this round shape here of the Sierra del Burros with its uplift. You can see some igneous bodies intruding through there. This is Cerro Colorado, where we went last month. I'll be talking about that trip to Rancho La Mula. Also the trip last summer to Noria de San Pedro and Rancho San Graciano. A trip to Sotero de Amezcua, and a trip to the Rancho Tiutacha, where El Abra is, which is the longest cave in Coahuila. Some of you folks have, I'm sure, have been caving in the Muskies area to the south. That's this area here, Rancho Los Ojos, where Ron Weatherford's been leading trips. I'll talk briefly about that. And also about another really impressive groundwater site here called El Hundido El Mulato. Out to the west, again, you see the igneous high mountains of the Sierra del Carmen, which get to about 3,000 meters elevation. Yeah?
Peter, I have no question. Is El Abra also the name of the mountain range where there are a bunch of caves farther south?
Yeah, that's down in San Luis Potosí. So again, here's the edge of the recharge zone, and then the Artesian Zone right in there. So our confined area, which is going to be mostly rocks like the Austin Chalk and the Butte Formation, are going to be over there to the east. So, starting with last summer, go through some of these recent trips. Here's our trip out to the Rancho San Graciano, which was a lot of fun. It's yes, it's warm in the desert in the summer, but it's also a great time to go because you're in the monsoon season, so you have water. Rivers start flowing. You can go swimming. So we went into the mountains by following up this drainage called the Arroyo La Sombra, which is one of the main drainages coming out of the north end of the Sierra del Burro, and also the largest drainage that goes into Lake Amistad from the Mexican side. So hiking around in the Arroyos is a good place to go looking for caves. You might find caves in the cliffs, or if you're really lucky, you might find a swallow in the riverbed. And what we found on this trip was a really cool resurgence cave. This is called Cueva El Sotol, and it's where it comes out of the ground. It forms a pretty good sized drainage, so a lot of water comes out of here at times, and this water actually has to flow up to come out of the cave. so down where Dylan is, there's a drop there down to the sump. So we've descended through the cave, but that's actually an upstream sump. Water flows out of the sump in rainy times. So definitely significant cave. But here's a little hand line climbing out to the sump while we're surveying. Jessica the cave. And then the sump over here on this side. So we were out of business, so it's a matter of coming back with cave divers. Fortunately, we know a few, so we have to do that at some point. But yeah, this water normally, well, there's actually water flows into the entrance in low flow periods, but when there's a lot of flow, water's going to be flowing out. I guess that makes it an estimated source. You could tell the water flowed in here not only because of the surface landforms, but also there was rimstones that indicated flow this way, so that maybe that's when the water's receding, or maybe when there's water flowing in the entrance from close by. So the other cool site we went to was this, which really surprised us. We weren't even aware of it when we went there, but it turns out that Gene had explored it 20 years previously in the first generation of blind cat projects. And it's, I can't remember, there's a headstone here that said it was built in 1918 or something like that. It's a natural pit that they enlarged and then built this windmill over. And normally it's apparently a 25-meter rappel to a sump. But when we arrived there, there had just been some big rains up in the mountains. And so, boom, it's flowing great guns. Over here on the right, Ken's inside the windmill structure there. And we tied a tape to him, and he dove down 12 meters vertically against the flow, just because he could.
I didn't find anything. I did learn something. I learned that zebra lights don't function that deep. They go off. But if you put water in an algae, and then you put the zebra light in that, and then you tighten the lid, the pressure does not change for the zebra light, so it'll keep functioning.
Or just take the pressure change.
So this is a cool site, and also deserves some cave diving. So apparently what happened in the late 90s is they rappelled down to the sump, dove 10 meters into this thing, probably free diving with a mask. Gene doesn't remember any tank hauling, but the report says it got narrow. But obviously with all this water coming out, it's definitely a significant resurgence for the area. There's reports from the locals of blind catfish coming out of here, but no samples have been obtained so far. So on this trip, last July, we spent several days in Rancho San Graciano area looking for caves, found a number of other small caves, and also went to another spring, which is the water source for the whole valley. That Norte de San Pedro that I showed you, obviously it only flows very rarely, maybe not even every year, who knows. But so the whole valley gets its water from this spring, which is located up one of these canyons, I think that one maybe. And they pipe it down to this big tank, and it provides all of the water for all of the ranches in the valley. So all the ranchers share this water. So there's pipes that go all over, and it's filling cattle troughs for their ranging operations. Moving on to the next trip here. In September, we did a trip to Sótano de Mezcua, first one in 17 years or something like that. Here we are biding our time before we get through the gate here at Rancho Seco. Sótano de Mezcua is the second longest cave in Coahuila, also a really cool cave, and it was one of the earliest sites that the blind cats were found in. It's 60 or 70 meter rappel, and it's great fun to do. There's a downstream passage and upstream passage. They both go to sumps. There's a landing at the bottom of the entrance pit. Ken made a few friends while he was there. And the upstream sump is just right, 20 meters off from where you land. Downstream sump, I think it's 100 meters down the downstream sump. But the upstream sump is actually where the bulk of the cave goes. I'll show you on the map here. And this is also where the blind catfish were found. Ken, the water was pretty turbid. I think there was calcite ice on the surface, but Ken and I did spot a blind cat while we're at that sump. And then we're also taking water samples, which I'll show you in a minute. So we're taking water samples to filter for environmental DNA. So there's a student at UT that's working on this relatively new technique for detecting animals by filtering water for their DNA. So we knew that blind catfish were here. We got the water sample from the pool right next to where there's a fish. So this was a sample for validation of the methods in a study. So the student is working on eDNA detection of blind cats and also Eurasius salamanders in the Austin area. Here's the entrance sinkhole to Mesquite, all in the background here. It stretches from here to here. And then in the distance, you'll see the Sierra del Burro, Rancho San Graciano, where we'd gone a few months prior to this trip. This is the first version of the map of Sotoneira de Mesquite. You can see the drop here, which is, I think, 70 meters. It's got a nice ledge in the middle. It's actually 2 parallel pits at first. And this plan view is actually north down. So flip this in your mind, and you can see that the initial part of the original survey only covered a small amount of the cave, because the upstream sump is where most of the cave passage is. And so it's quite long. And I think it still goes in the upstream direction, maybe? Jean's nodding her head. That's a good sign. That means she's looking for tank callers. Towards the end of that trip, we also were keen to go look at some really cool pictographs that the ranchers had told us about. So here we had drove up to the Rio Grande, which is about here, and went to 3 different rock art sites. I'm just going to show you a picture that Drew took of the coolest one. These sites were all previously documented, but this one was a fantastic example of the Pecos rock art style, with the shamans holding otlotls and lots of really cool stuff. We were pretty much had our minds blown at this site. In March, 3-4 months ago, we had a chance to go back to Rancho Tio Tacho, which is a really cool ecotourism ranch on the finest surface river in the Burros. It's a river that's comparable to like the Frio River in Texas. So here's Carolyn as we're headed out towards Rancho Tio Tacho, having crossed the Piedras Negras. And this is exploring up the Rio San Rodrigo, which goes, I don't know, like about 20 kilometers. You can drive up this river, literally driving up the river. And one thing we wanted to do was go back into El Abra, the longest cave in Coahuila, and work on surveying a few leads left over, taking a look at whether the cave might actually continue at the downstream end, and also we got eDNA water samples there too, I believe.
We did.
And so El Abra is actually located in the bed of Calabasas Canyon. It's a really cool entrance. It actually has an upstream section too, which pretty quickly sumps. Pretty tight sump. I'm not sure if any diver is going to be interested in It's very maze-like. It's a sort of a parallelogram rectilinear maze in places. Other places just a long stream passage. Most of which we surveyed, I think, in the early 2000s. But this is the area where I was surveying, and I think the only person that got to the very downstream end of the cave was Dylan, where previously I think Andy Glusenkamp reported that the stream got really low and there were some stalls, but Dylan squeezed through and says the cave keeps going. So that would be a good cave to go back to. It's a great cave. You just don't want to be there in the rainy season. The entrance is here. It's a little more complicated than what's shown here, but yeah, so that these are 1 kilometer squares. You can see it's basically staying under this Cañon, it's Cañon Sandabe. Sandabe is a fork off of Calabasas Canyon, and we also went to Calabasas Canyon this trip because we had heard reports of from a Mexican biologist of another blind catfish site, which part of the group visited. And going through old notes, I actually had seen that Gene had made note of this site 1997, I think, but we didn't get to it in that trip. So it's a spring, again, in the bed of a canyon. But I didn't get to go there, so I should let Kate or Jess talk about this, right? It's a cool place. What happened when you guys went there?
Yeah, so at first, when you just look at it from here, it doesn't look necessarily that promising. And even from what you see inside, it looks like just a tiny little water puddle. But Andy ripped off his clothes and jumped on in and was able to just barely squeeze through. He had a snorkel. There we go. And with that nice curvature of his snorkel, he was able to get in there. And Dean was holding Andy's boot at first, to make sure we were all listening for him breathing once he went out of reach. And then it was a little scary because we were, oh, fuck! But sure enough, it was that he found a blind cat. And this is, Andy's been studying them for years, but this is his first one to see in the wild. And he went back to get his camera and his net, and he was able to scoop one up. He said he saw another one that was even bigger than this one. This one was pretty little, but probably the most photographed blind cat in the world.
And it was neat because there was such a good group of, Mexican ichthyologists and ranch managers and, folks from here. And so it was a neat mix of, as well, scientists and, land managers that work on this land and cavers. And so everybody was so excited about this. And, some people are just new and trying to contribute what they can to this effort. And some people have been studying the species for decades. And so it was for, groundwater species in general. So it was neat to see everybody so excited.
Yeah, so this was when 3 years ago, after we found the blind cat in Texas, that reinvigorated this blind cat, what we now call the Blind Cat Working Group. And which had been led by Dean Hendrickson, professor at UT, and blind cats are really one of his specialties. And rumor has it he was thinking of retiring, but this killed that idea. So Dean had organized some Mexican biologists and Mexican land managers. We all had a meeting with U.S. National Park Service personnel in the middle of the dam at Lake Amistad in this crazy building they call the Neutral Zone. And so it got land managers from both sides from both countries talking to each other. We had a good meeting, and we all were determined to follow that up by actually getting out in the field and doing something. So one of the main reasons for this trip was to get these people together and go into the field and go see some blind catfish. And we also invited the cavers from the Monterey Tech Caving Club so they could come and see the cave. And so, yeah, we all got together and sang Kumbaya, cooked beef steak, and drank a lot of beer. So great trip. And now on to the last one, which was just about 3 weeks ago. A little bit on Prop 2. So we had a rather small group, but we had 6 of us head out to the northwest corner of the Burros, where I showed you that one igneous peak kind of sticking out. That's Cerro Colorado. So you can see that it's looks a bit different than the limestone ranges. And it was a cool area. We really didn't find much of the way of caves and basically no groundwater, but we had a great time exploring. We did find one pit that was about 20 meters deep and not even big enough to get your helmet in. But again, we did some hiking around in the drainages and what little time we had. Got rather warm. I think the thermometer said 107 at one point. So there was a few siestas involved. And of course, the obligatory dip in San Felipe Springs on the way back. Now, San Felipe Springs is related to the groundwater of Northern Coahuila, because this is one of many springs on both sides of the border that were augmented when they built Lake Amistad. So when they dammed up the Rio Grande and the Devil's River and the Pecos, the 3 rivers that form Amistad, that raised the water table all around. It's a big dome in the water table. So springs, a lot of springs almost doubled in size when the lake was filled. So this is a spring that was pre-existing. It's one of the biggest springs in Texas also, but became bigger. And so obviously we know that water is reaching it from the lake because of that. And we also know that waters around the lake, the subterranean waters are connected across the river because we have this species of cave fish that's crossing back and forth. So it's all intertwined. I'll talk a little bit more about groundwater in the area, some of the other interesting sites. At the south end of the Burros, this is one of the most impressive groundwater sites, which is called Sotero de Yermo, or Hundido el Mulato. And this is a place where you have a vertical cave that goes down to a river passage. It's about, I believe it's about a 60-meter pit. As you can see, it's a huge entrance, big sinkhole, similar to a mezcua. And it goes down and it hits, this is an incomplete map, only the downstream part has been drawn. But where this pit lands, you've got an upstream section and a downstream section. Downstream section goes over flowstone waterfalls down to a sump full of blind catfish. This is one of the earliest known sites for the species. Access is difficult to the cave, so we haven't been able to get back out there, but I hope to arrange that. But the cool thing about this site is I think it's a really significant groundwater site for the south end of the Burros, because when it rains a lot in the mountains, water completely fills up the cave. So this is the same place as this, and it fills it up and it creates a fountainhead. So there's a geyser that comes out of this cave. So there's a huge catchment feeding this thing, and we don't know where that catchment is, and we also don't know where this water goes normally. It's going out underneath the Muskie's Valley, and there's down, as you head down to Muskie's and downstream there, the towns of Sabinas and Nueva Rosita. I don't know about any springs down there until you get down to a bit farther south. There's some small hot springs, but not anything that are going to account for this. Until we get down to Monclova. A few folks here went to Muskie's in March, to Rancho Las Aguilas, to the Enriquez property. That's kind of similar to Los Ojos, where Juan's been leading trips, where there's like dozens or hundreds of vertical caves. Not much in the way of getting to groundwater or finding springs, but just south between Muskie's and Rancho Las Aguilas, there is this really cool place here, which we named the egg funnel. And it's something I spotted on Google Earth, and it just looked like a resurgence. So we hiked over there, and sure enough, it's a huge sinkhole. There's an arroyo comes out of it, And it's very steep angle of proposed. What's really interesting is what's down at the bottom, which is this pile of eggs, this pile of rounded limestone cobbles. So water comes out of here. There wasn't any water when we were there. The air seemed really moist down in there. And if you try to dig it open, more rocks keep falling down. So you need to set up a pretty concerted dig. But I'm quite certain that if once you got into here, that you would get to water, probably a cave diving dig. We didn't feel airflow really, but it definitely felt really, really moist. So a lot of water comes out of here and it rolls those rocks around. So it's a cool site that we should do dig out one day. Just a brief showing of all those pits at Los Ojos farther west. This is definitely recharge zone stuff, and this area is really famous now for all these fantastically deep pits up to 300 meters deep, and there's just literally hundreds of them. This one here is 250 meters deep, for example. And a profile I've done a while back just showing how perforated this area is. I'm pretty sure God walked across this landscape with his crampons on. Some of these have been explored, a lot of these haven't been explored, so if you're interested in doing vertical caving, talk to Ron.
Next trip in late September.
Finally, we're going to end up at the very south end of that first slide I showed you, way down to the south at Monclova. And this cave, also called El Hundido, is really, really spectacular. You may recall from those first slides that you have these, I was calling them basin and range ridges, where you have limestone ridges that kind of stick up out of a plain. They're not continuous ridges, and that's because there's all these, they're anticlinal, so they're poking up out of these surrounding rocks, which are non-karstic, and the water can't come out of. But what you get is this one little range called the Sierra La Rata. I say little, but it's actually a plunging anticline. So the rocks, it's an anticline like this, it's folded like that, but it also dips down at either end. It's a classic plunging anticline. And it's basically a place where the limestone is peeking its head up out of the planet. And it's what it seems to me is going on is the last place the water can escape. At the very south end, El Hundido, Bustamante is over here, Monclova is down there. So let's take a closer look at it. This cave was explored in 1994 by Bev Shea and Alan Cobb, and they were calling it Spewing Carp Cave because the rangers were telling them that, oh yes, carp spew out of here after it rains. But normally it's a 50-meter pit, vertical crack down to a lake of unknown depth that is also normally covered by about this much backwater. There's a whole lot of bats living there. So not too appealing for diving, but it really needs to be dived. So this is what it looks like in normal conditions. And on the right, with this huge, beautiful river coming out after a flood. So this flowed for 25 days after a hurricane passed over the area. I don't really know where the rain fell during this event. It'd be nice to really try to dive into some data to find that out. In other words, where's the recharge zone? I feel like it's coming from the north up towards Muskies. I guess I partially base that on the fact that this resurgence is at the south end of that Sierra La Rata. So I feel like the water's coming from the north. But we don't really know, but it's a really amazing site. I haven't seen it myself when it flows. This is the upwelling right here, coming up that 50-meter pit. So it's forming a fountainhead, and it's hot, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The ranger kept measuring it the whole time it was flowing, and even when it stopped flowing and started to recede back down the pit, it was still 104 degrees. What I don't know is that the case in normal conditions at that sump 50 meters down? My guess is it's not. I think this hot water is being pushed out by the input of all that water from the flood, but we need to go back there, first off measure the water temperature, and also try to get some cave divers in there. I expect that dive is going to be vertical for some unknown distance. So it might be a good thing for your, I don't know, your mini submarine or something like
Crystals.
That's it for my talk. I think there's a lot more photographers, and I managed to get names up there on. So if you took some of those pictures that I pirated from previous shows, I apologize. But yeah, here we are crossing back into Texas last month at Amistad Dam, which is the most lovely border crossing in the entire country. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Niagara Falls might compete with it, but. So we're doing lots of trips to northern Mexico. Everybody should go. Get your passport. Talk to me, talk to Ron Rutherford, talk to Jim Kennedy. These are all places that we can go on long weekends. And I've kind of divulged what I know or what I think I know about what the groundwater's doing in northern Coahuila, but there's a whole lot we don't know, so we need to go and do a lot more exploring. Thanks.
Are there no Mexican hydrogeologists working on any of that?
I've been trying to find somebody who's interested in that area, and I've talked to a few at like Mexico City, but it's a long way for them. And we did get some biologists. My biologist came up from Mexico City to meet us in March, but yeah, no hydrogeologists. And I've been trying to drum up some interest in doing some dye tracing to try to connect like a mezquit of good enough springs, and still waiting to get much interest in that. But it's a really fascinating area, and it would be a great place for somebody to do a thesis or whatever. Yeah.
So it seems like there's a drastic difference between this drier season and when the rains come in. So when you look on Google Maps for what you might possibly want to explore, are you looking for like little lakes too? Considering that
Really-
picture might have been taken.
Really like that egg funnel, the Embudo de Huevos, was just a place where there was you could see a drainage, going upstream, and then it just started at one spot.
Okay.
So that kind of stuck out. Otherwise, like all those pits around Musquis, around Los Ojos, we actually found those with stereo photographs like they used in World War II, where you can take these black and white prints and you look through a stereo glasses that you can find that way, and you can't find looking at Google Earth because it's just not the resolution, or you just can't spot it. If we had LiDAR for that area, which we don't, that would be another way to find caves and such.
Bring your drones.
Drones, yeah.
So early in the presentation, you showed the map that had the contributing zone and the recharge zone and the Artesian Zone across both sides of the border. And you mentioned the southern part of the Artesian Zone is unknown. And I was curious also about the western edge extending further into Mexico, because so many maps I see of the Edwards Aquifer into Del Rio. And so do you know about the western boundary of the contributing and recharge zone?
Yeah, well, in Texas, the recharge zone is defined by the outcrop of the Edwards Formation. In Coahuila, you've got some different rocks, but they're still recharging the same aquifer. You've got also some of the same rocks occurring on both sides of the river. When you get west of the Burros, and you start getting into the igneous stuff and more into the basin and range. So I think that when you get into those ridges of the basin and range, that you're probably getting into a different aquifer right there. But again, we don't really know. That whole area of Rancho Los Ojos, where those hundreds of pits are, those caves are quite deep, but we don't know where water going into them comes out. Whether it comes out at the Nacimiento de Rio Sabinas, or whether it goes into larger groundwater area that may eventually go on down all the way down to the big Hundido at Monclova, which is like 100 kilometers away. We don't know.
The Cretaceous rocks go all the way over to the Big Bend, the Sierra Carmen area, so it's gonna get complicated over there.
Hey, what about the Priatella catfish? How are they related or at all to the catfish we get out of the deep aquifer around San Antonio? I remember Seitan and Is that totally
Yeah,
different stuff, or is it?
So there's, as you mentioned, there's 2 blind catfish species that live deep under San Antonio, up to 600 meters deep, well below sea level. And those fish can only be found coming out of wells. So they're deep dwellers. You can't go into Genesis Cave on Loop 1604, which goes down in the aquifer, and find those fish because they're deep dwelling fish. And we think that they exist in this deep part of the Edwards because they're living off an ecosystem that occurs at the bad water line, where you got sulfur-eating bacteria that are then eaten by crustaceans, and the fish are feeding on those. So there's 2 species of catfish there, really interesting. We think that one of them might possibly predate on the other. So that possible predator fish, or whatever you might want to call it, is called Satan, is the name of the genus. The other species is called Trogloglanus, but recent studies looking at the morphology of the blind cats and also some genetics leads the blind cat specialists to believe that Trogloglanus and Prietella might actually be the same genus, is what I'm understanding, but more work needs to be done.
That was what,
Yeah.
So, Lake Amistad hasn't been there, hasn't been on the border for very long, like really just.
1970 or something.
Right. So, and you found a blind catfish after the lake was in place, and as you said, the impounding of the water in the lake has raised the water table. Has there been any speculation that the catfish is in Texas as a result of a raised water table that's allowed it to cross the Rio Grande?
That's a good question. The fish has to occur in caves, in submerged caves. So it's highly unlikely that it would have crossed through the open waters of the lake. So it's in the groundwater. So it's crossed. The population's crossed underneath the lake. One could, I suppose, look back at old well data and try to figure out what the water table, how much the water table's risen, or where that water, how much lower that water table was when ranchers drilled wells next to the Rio Grande before the lake was there. What depth did they reach water? I guess maybe be above the river, but I'm not really sure. The idea of karst conduits going underneath rivers is a really fascinating one and not really very well looked at. I wonder the same thing, if the same thing could be occurring here in Austin, in the vicinity of Mount Bunnell, for example, where we've got some big springs on the south side. We've got Barton Springs and we've got Cold Spring. We also have springs on the north side, Mormon Spring. Could there be karst conduits going underneath the lake that salamanders could go through? Maybe. Really interesting topic. Kevin?
Yeah. So what I've been taught is hydrology here in Texas for the Edwards Aquifer is that the water flows from south to north. Does that same thing apply in Mexico? Is it flowing south to north?
Maybe, but I think my guess is that it's flowing in both directions because we had the Hundido El Mulato at the south end of the burrows, where obviously a lot of water is shooting through there. Then again, on the north side, we have all the water that comes out of Good Enough Spring on the border underneath Lake Amistad. And it's long been theorized that water comes from Coahuila. People have observed that when there's rainfall events in Coahuila and not Texas, the water can become turbid coming out of Good Enough Springs. Also, a recent study that was presented a few weeks ago at a groundwater meeting here in Texas by the Water Development Board, where they've been looking at groundwater in Valverde County. What they found is that the geochemistry of the water coming out of Good Enough Springs is much different than the groundwater in the Pecos and the Devil's River areas. So again, and also it's thermally elevated. Good Enough Springs is several degrees hotter than normal spring water in the area. So that probably means Good Enough Springs is coming from deep, and it may mean that it's coming from far away in the mountains of the Cerro del Burro, but We need a dye trace. Did I mention that in here? Oh. Ken?
I have sort of a tangential question. If water's coming out of that one area at 104 degrees, it must be getting heated by something, maybe some sort of proximate, lava, magma flows. Yeah, and what I'm recalling is that the Naika mine crystals formed in around 115 degree waters. And of course, there's some of the most spectacular now lost to humanity formations I've ever heard of. And I wonder if that kind of crystal formation might be happening in that area.
Good question. The Nike crystals were kind of like an entranceless void, for what that's worth, like a geo kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. If you could take your mini sub down into either El Rayo and follow that hot water deep down into the earth, you might enter a vast cavern full of 100-meter long crystals, 10 meters in diameter. Make the Nikite crystals look small. Well, I suppose we probably don't have much time here in the room, so we'll talk about it more later.
Yeah.